everyone. Welcome to the June 20th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking back at last weekend's racing from around the country. And Craig, this felt like a weekend where we saw some nice horses in action, not necessarily in the top-level races, but it felt like a weekend where, from the stakes races down to maiden races, we saw some talented horses maybe setting themselves up for some bigger goals later in the summer.
I think that's a good explanation of kind of what we saw. We didn't see a lot of big top grade one racing or anything, but we saw some speed figures that show that maybe some of these horses will get there at some point later on in the year.
Yeah, we're going to start off our recap at Belmont Park, where we'll discuss their feature race last week, the Bed of Roses, probably the highest quality race that we saw anywhere in the country. Then we'll move on to Monmouth Park, where they ran the Monmouth Stakes card, 4 stakes races. Craig and I did that on the TimeformUS Forecast last week. We'll recap that stakes action. Then we'll move on to Ellis Park and Santa Anita, where they ran a couple of stakes races and also some maiden performances worth discussing among the 2-year-olds from each of those venues. But Craig, we'll kick things off at Belmont, and that Bed of Roses, it really did live up to the hype. Like we said on our stakes preview last week, small field, but definitely a high quality one. And Goodnight Olive, she took all the money, getting bet down to 1-5, and didn't necessarily perform like a 1-5 shot should. I mean, she made her backers sweat a little bit, but she ultimately got there in the end, and that's what you want to see from a horse that is coming off a championship, just finding a way to win.
And she basically ran the same speed figure she's been running. I know I mentioned it on a race preview. She had a long string of low 120 speed figures, and she got a 121 for this win. And yeah, she got the job done, and I don't want to knock her too much. I mean, I think Wicked Halo is really good. I think Caramel Swirl took a step forward in here, and I kind of liked what I saw from Goodnight Olive. I thought she showed some grit from that inside post, and I think she's been a bit unlucky to keep being inside. And I think we'll see some better speed figures if she can get a better trip. I won't say it's a bad trip, but I don't think it's necessarily one that she likes in behind horses.
Yeah, I saw some people saying in the immediate aftermath of the race that she was unlucky or had a bad trip, and sort of akin to last time when she got blocked in traffic. I didn't see it that way at all, and just based on the way the connections are handling Goodnight Olive, I think we have to abandon ourselves of this thought that she's a speed horse, because Chad Brown and Irad Ortiz clearly don't view her as a speed horse. I mean, she did win Gate to Wire earlier in her career, but since she's really attained this top-level form, winning these grade 1 races, they rip her off the pace every time. Even if she breaks well, Irad gets her covered up and then produces her in the stretch, and she's able to finish off these races and get up to win. But they rode her from last to first here, like that was the intention. So, I mean, I don't really view it as an unlucky trip. I think they'd probably take her off the pace even if she drew outside, though maybe she wouldn't have to wait so long in behind horses. But that's just the way that they've been riding Goodnight Olive recently, and she's obviously producing from those kinds of trips. So I don't really think we can say that she was unlucky in that sense. As for the rest of the field, I mean, Wicked Halo, like you said, she was really game. She was fighting back at the end once Goodnight Olive ranged up alongside her. And even Caramel Swirl maybe moved a little bit too soon around the far turn. She did get that uncovered trip, but had to go wide. So I thought the top 3 all ran well, and I think it just speaks to the fact that there really is some depth to this division. And obviously, Goodnight Olive is the clear leader, but I don't think it's going to be an easy path for her the rest of the season.
No, I mean, just these couple gave her all she wanted. I mean, it looked for a long way like to me, Caramel Swirl was actually going to get up. So Goodnight Olive did show some gameness in the lane, but there's some more players than what we saw last year, where Goodnight Olive was a pretty easy winner of most of her races.
Well, let's move on to some of the non-stakes events at Belmont Park from this past week, and a couple of strong speed figures in allowance races on both Thursday and Friday at Belmont. On Thursday, we saw Tonal Impact win his second straight race for Linda Rice in a high-level optional claimer, and, Craig, I don't know if this is a horse that has graded stakes in his future necessarily, but the pickings were a little slim this week with regards to stakes racing and what we're going to talk about, and this is just a horse that has been steadily improving since he came into Linda Rice's barn. I think at the end of last year, he's been running just about every 3 or 4 weeks or so and just keeps stepping up his game, and was able to beat this field here with his patented strong finish.
Yeah, it was a big effort. He also got a 121 speed figure off a 118 last time when he won really easily in an allowance race. So it seems like these one turn routes have really, I mean, that's what he's been running in for a while, but it just seems like what's in the ballpark for him. He likes them. I'm not sure where he goes, but he's got to be running out of conditions, I would think, soon. So I would imagine the stakes will be in his future. And the way he's handling these assignments, I think he could step in and run well. This was a race that had a pretty slow pace. It's not like he was far behind, but he was mid pack and was still able to get the job done. So just a good, strong effort from him.
Yeah, this horse is just rock solid. He's been in the money in his last 12 starts in a row, even dating back to before Linda Rice claimed him for $40,000, and he has certainly made back that claiming tag and then some since getting into this barn, especially with these last couple of victories in some high-pursed allowance races. And he really delivered here. The pace wasn't that fast, and he was really finishing at the end, and also a good effort from the runner-up, Kinetic Sky, who was formerly in the Linda Rice barn, but was making his first start off the claim here for the recently reinstated Rick Dutrow, and big improvement off the claim for him. I know that Dutrow has only achieved one victory since coming back. I think that was with his first starter, but we've seen a few horses actually improve or off the claim or off a private purchase or trainer switch. So the horses are definitely running for him, and those two just drew well clear of the rest of the field. Move on to another allowance race from the Friday card at Belmont Park. This one was going a mile and an eighth on the turf. And Skims here, Craig, she is a filly for Shug McGahee that had run in some nice races last year as a 3-year-old. I think she actually won a Group 2 event, the Sands Point, towards the end of the season. They tried a really tough spot with her for her 4-year-old debut, racing in the Jenny Wiley against In Italian, and she just wasn't quite that good. And they dropped into a more realistic spot here, and she really rewarded the connections by delivering a dominating performance.
She did. I like how you're in Royal Ascot form calling it a Group 2. That she when she won the the Sands Point last year. But yeah, she was a filly who showed some talent as a 3-year-old. Her speed figures weren't anything to write home about. They were decent, but nothing special. But it looks like she's taken a big jump as a 4-year-old, as you might expect. Even losing to an Italian by over 7 lengths last time. Obviously, that one's so good. She was still able to record a 120 speed figure that day, and she did it again here, actually increasing her speed figure all the way up to a 124. That one's a little bit pace upgraded off a 121 final time, as she was able to sit in behind pretty slow fractions and get the job done. But I really liked what I saw. I mean, she beat a pretty good horse in Atomic Blonde, and she did it rather easily.
Yeah, we're recording this on Tuesday morning, and I have Royal Ascot on in the background. It's probably messing with my brain a little bit. But yes, I agree with everything you said. Skims was really impressive here. She was keen in the early stages because there wasn't a whole lot of pace going on. That stretch-out sprinter, Star Divine, was setting the early pace, but going pretty slowly. And you could see moving down the backstretch, Don Velasquez had a handful of horse, and Skims almost doing too much at that point, but I thought Johnny did a good job keeping her covered up and not sort of falling into that trap of letting her make an early move. And he kept her covered up right until I got into the stretch and was able to find a seam. And once she found daylight, she just exploded through that hole. And even if you watch the gallop out, she is really finishing past the wire down the stretch, opening up on this field. So feels like one that's going to be ready for that step back up into graded stakes company next time. Probably won't be looking for a race with In Italian in it again, but she's the kind of horse that could win some grade 2s or grade 3s down the line. Then we'll wrap up the Belmont action by talking about a maiden special weight event from the Saturday card. This one was going a mile and a 16th for the 3-year-olds, and we had some experienced runners in here, plus one first-time starter, and that was the one that took all the money, Donegal Forever, going out for Todd Pletcher with Irad Ortiz in the irons. And Craig, I know it's not the fastest speed figure that we're going to see from a 3-year-old debut runner, but I really liked what I saw from this horse. Just the professionalism after a difficult start, racing in behind horses, coming through traffic, and the way he finished was pretty impressive.
It was. He wound up with a 105 speed figure, and I think that's kind of like maybe the third or fourth thing worth talking about in the race. He was really impressive. The word was out, obviously. He took a lot of money. I don't think it was the strongest maiden field you're ever going to see, but you had a lot of horses in here who had run upper 90 type time form US speed figures consistently. So it's not like he beat a bunch of maiden claimers either. And as you said, he had a lot of problems at the start. And one of the things I think we have to mention is Irad Ortiz, how he stayed on that horse when they were showing it on the Fox show. All the different replays, just amazing athleticism to be able to stay on the horse, get back in the reins, and just stay calm despite that going to his face almost after a couple strides out of the gate was super impressive, and I'm sure we're going to see this one progressing pretty quickly through the ranks.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk at Belmont about how much money the Irad Ortiz horses are taking, and sometimes it kind of defies logic. I mean, when we just talked about that race, the Tonal Impact one, he was on a horse for Chad Brown's Stage Raider that have to justify that kind of inexplicably went off at even money off a poor performance and was nowhere. And I mean, on days like that, you're kind of scratching your head, but then Irad Ortiz comes on Saturday and wins 5 races and delivers a ride like this, where I mean, he has to show the athleticism to stay in the saddle and then rides this first-time starter with so much confidence, slicing through the pack. I mean, he really is an extremely talented rider, and I don't want that to get lost in the conversation when we're sort of saying that these horses are overbet sometimes. But he certainly had the horse underneath him to deliver the kind of ride that he did on Donegal Forever, because the thing that really struck me about this horse in the stretch was just the stride on him. I mean, the ground that this horse covers with every step is pretty breathtaking. He really picks up his feet and extends himself, and just feels like the kind of horse that's only getting started going a mile in the 16th, so I assume that the connections will probably seek out a 2-turn mile and an 8th allowance race at Saratoga next time. Feels a little late for him to make some of the top 3-year-old races like the Travers, but I'll be interested to see how this one develops.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just one of those when he debuts, Todd Pletcher debuts a horse at a mile and a 16th. I kind of figured he knew what he was doing. This was a horse who probably isn't the quickest to get going, but as you said, that stride in the lane was impressive. I mean, he was just moving away with every step, and the more distance, the better, it seems to me. And maybe even a race like the Curlin wouldn't be outside his scope. Maybe that'd be a bit too ambitious, but I'm sure we're going to see him at Saratoga.
Yeah, maybe a lot of that depends on whether or not an allowance race comes up. Sometimes those can be tough to fill, but we'll see. As you said, the Curlin sometimes comes up like an allowance race, so maybe that would be a realistic target for him. Let's move on to Monmouth Park, where we'll discuss some of the graded stakes or stakes racing there from the past weekend, mostly on the Saturday card where they ran 4 of them. I suppose the feature race was the Grade 3 Monmouth, this one going the mile and an eighth distance for the older horses, and disappointing performance from the favorite Tribuvan, who set the pace, a pressured pace, but really had nothing to offer in the stretch. And Craig Catnip, a horse that neither of us particularly liked on the forecast last week, just took yet another step forward. And I think that's really the story of this horse's career, is he just keeps improving with every start. Mike Stidham was confident to place him in this Grade 3 event off his allowance victory against Weaker in his prior start, but he certainly rewarded that faith.
He did, and he took another pretty big step forward, all the way up to a 123 time form US speed figure. And it was kind of an interesting trip, too. He was a horse who was right there on the pace, got shuffled back a little bit, and it didn't really deter him at all, something that maybe might have done in a lesser horse. But he was just game to the wire, was able to get up and get the job done. And as you said, I didn't particularly like him. And normally I like horses that have these advancing speed figures. He's still just a 4-year-old gelding, so he should keep improving. And I just whiffed on this one because I have nothing to knock on this effort. It was a good, solid race from him.
Yeah, it was I think a key point in the race was the backstretch where a couple of horses, Never Explain and Speaking Scout, made these seemingly premature moves. It seemed like Never Explain was a little keen and wanted to go, and ended up moving forward, and Speaking Scout followed him, and they went 3 and 4 or 5 wide down the backstretch to move up and sort of break open the race at that point. I think it forced the leader, Tribuvan, a little bit, and credit to Joel Rosario, who admittedly has struggled a little bit this this year to find his top riding form. I think that's been a big story of 2023. But he showed sort of the patience that you're used to seeing from Joel to not get tricked into making that early move. And he allowed this horse to go from his stalking position back into mid-pack, waited, and then made that last move. And it really proved to be the right decision because he was finishing at the end with an energy that the others just lacked in this race. So nice performance from Catnip, and we'll see if he can validate this performance against maybe some tougher company next time. Move on to the other turf stakes from this Monmouth Saturday card. That was the Grade 3 Eatontown, this one for the fillies and mares. And Craig, the result of this race definitely flatters that recent Grade 1 New York winner, Market Segmentation, as the top two finishers from this race, Consumer Spending, and surprisingly, we're both coming off second and third place finishes behind Market Segmentation in that bogey, and they validated that form here, finishing ahead of the favorite Gina Romantica, who might have needed to start off the layoff.
Yeah, no doubt. And this was a race that totally changed with a couple scratches. There was some speed in the race, both scratched out, left no speed, and that's exactly how it played out on paper. This race had really dawdling fractions. All of them were coded in blue. The final time speed figure was only a 103. This race got a huge Timeform US pace upgrade, about as big as you're going to see, all the way up to 124 for the winner. So this is one, the figure, I may be taking it with a little grain of salt, but I don't want to knock the top two. I do think they both ran very well given the circumstances. It's just one, the speed figure gets a little tough when they run this slow early.
And I think I misspoke a little bit. Gina Romantica did not go off as the favorite in this race. She was the morning line favorite. Surprisingly, took a huge late hit to go down to 6-5. I think at the last flash, it seems like there were a lot of late odds shifts at the last flash at Monmouth on Saturday. We won't go into all of that, though there was some good information that came out about all those CAW players yesterday on, if you want to check out my social media feed, some good information from the Thoroughbred Idea Foundation on that. But we saw some of that action in play, and that definitely made surprisingly a strong favorite here, Craig. And, kind of discussing the price differential between her and Consumer Spending, I certainly didn't see that coming when I handicapped the race. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me that Consumer Spending would be 9-2 and surprisingly would be 6-5. And definitely you got the better value on Consumer Spending, who came through and won the race. Arguably, surprisingly, a little unlucky because she had to wait for room along the inside, but she also saved all the ground, and I think at the end of the day was just second best.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. It's really tough to judge for me when you get this kind of slow pace. I'm not sure saving ground makes much of a difference when you're just basically walking for the first 3/4 of a mile. But again, I don't want to knock the top two. Consumer Spending was good. I mean, she's a horse that's moving in the right direction. And, Chad Brown has her going well. And I would say she'll probably make another move back up the class ladder and see how she fares.
And let me just say, before we move on from this race, Gina Romantica is a horse that I would maybe keep an eye on for next time out, because she's a horse that wants to get covered up and produce a finish. And I think sometimes these slow-paced races, they work against horses like this, even when they're right up on the pace like she was. She was a little keen and not really able to settle the same way that she's able to when she's behind horses early. So just the wrong trip for her off the layoff. So maybe one that you want to give another chance to when she shows up in probably a logical spot next time. Let's move on to some of the dirt action from this Saturday card at Monmouth. The Grade 3 Salvatore Mile, a race that we obviously handicapped on the forecast last week and also did a stakes preview for, Craig. And one thing that we had really discussed ahead of this race was the pace scenario and how much speed was signed on. And I don't know where it all went. I guess a couple horses didn't break that sharply. The mile distance has a very short run into that first turn, and sometimes if horses aren't quick enough to get that position, they're forced to take back a little bit as the outside runners converge towards the inside. But it just seemed like a lot of horses didn't attain the forward position that we were expecting, and the pace ended up shockingly being slow.
Yeah, incredibly slow even. I mean, the early pace figure was barely in the low 90s, and this is a race that had a race rating of 121. So just crazy slow. These are the races that can be really frustrating as a handicapper. It seemed like the jockeys, after the break, if the things don't go their way, they're just content to sit there and just kind of take the damage. And it's one where I don't know if Petulante was the best horse or not. Ran 116 TimeformUS Speed figure. Nimitz class was really game to the wire. This was a race. Didn't quite fit where I could have gave it a breakout because of the slow pace, but I do think it had an effect on the speed figure.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That it's not a race that should be broken out. I mean, I think Nimitz class probably didn't run to his optimum level today or in this race because he was one of those that broke a little slowly. He actually broke towards the back of the pack. His jockey used him a little bit to get forward into the first turn, but I also thought rode him with confidence, like he was just going to win the race, and maybe he didn't see that late run from Petulante coming, and he tried to battle back at the end, but just couldn't quite fend off that rival who was really getting an aggressive finish ride from Luis Saez. Those two, they ran the best races. We should note, Craig, that this day in time on TimeformUS for the dirt races has a dark blue color coding, which indicates a heavy closer bias. And watching some of these dirt races, I get it. It did feel like maybe the rail was not where you wanted to be, and horses moving down the center of the track might have had an advantage.
Yeah, it's one I want to go back and look, but I watched all these, well, at least the last two-thirds of the card live, and I kind of got that impression as well. And I was impressed at Petulante. We have mentioned him on the previews. He was a horse who had shown a lot of speed and was shown back in the pace projector, but it was a good ride by Luis Saez because it was a race that had fractions like a turf race, and he kind of rode him like a turf race and just gave him a good covered up trip, was able to get to the outside and wear down Nimitz class. So, yeah, I don't want to knock either of the top two, but this turned out to be a pretty weak grade three. How much I want to put on the pace, that's kind of debatable.
The other dirt stakes at Monmouth on Saturday was the Pegasus. This is the local prep for the Haskell, and we'll see if any of these horses have a significant impact on the Haskell, though the winner of this race, Craig, might have a bit of a future. I don't know if he's going to win a Grade 1 race next time, but salute the stars. This was a breakout performance for him because we had seen him get on the dirt for the first time at Churchill in his last start and put in a gritty performance to get the victory that day, and he came back here stepping up in class, and it was an interesting trip, to say the least. I mean, he got bumped at the start, steadied back early, squeezed between rivals, was really rank after that, not wanting to settle under Joel Rosario, ultimately settled down a little bit on the backstretch, but then got spun wide into the stretch, and he really finished at the end to run down Kings Barnes, who had no excuse not to win this race. Kings Barnes had everything go his way, stalking outside, and salute the stars, despite all that trouble, still ran him down.
This is a case where we give pace upgrades to horses and, kind of adjust figures a little bit. And Salute the Stars actually got knocked down a point from a 118 final time to a 117, while King's Barn, the runner up, was a 118. But if we took trips into account, I don't think there's any doubt that Salute the Stars ran the better race. I know we talked about him on the forecast, and both of us thought that wasn't your typical off the turf performance that you could just disregard. And he really stepped up here. Now, to a race like the Haskell, I'm not so sure he's quite ready for that, but he's moving in the right direction. And I doubt we'll see him on turf anytime soon, given these last two.
Next up is the Get Serious Stakes, which was the stakes that they ran at Monmouth on Sunday. And I don't think we have to spend a whole lot of time on this one, Craig. Groom's All Business, a 4-year-old who definitely has taken a step forward from his form from last year for trainer Jorge Duarte, beat the heavy favorite Our Shot. I think the real key aspect here is that there was a pretty intense pace duel in the early stages. 3 speed horses going at it, and it just kind of set it up for those that were sitting a little off the pace.
Yeah, it set it up for him and for the favorite, our shot, who wasn't quite able to hold to get to Groom's All Business. Good effort from him. He got a 118 TimeformUS speed figure. Another one of these 4-year-olds who is just moving forward in his speed figures. He finally got back to his best 3-year-old number and got a career best here. And he's good. And just these turf sprints, it's going to come down to trips. And he got a great one on Sunday.
At Ellis Park this past weekend, they ran a stakes for the 3-year-old fillies on Saturday. The Monomoy Girl, this one going the 1 mile distance around that 1.5 turns at Ellis Park. And two major players from the division showing up here, Craig. Wet Paint, who was the significant favorite in the Kentucky Oaks, along with Hoosier Philly, who was coming off that runner-up finish in the Black Eyed Susans, kind of getting back on track in that race, and she continued that forward momentum into here. The pace, though, had a major impact on the result of this race because it really helped Hoosier Philly and it really worked against Wet Paint.
Yeah, it was pretty predictable. I know we talked about the Pimlico race on the Pacecast and review, and we both liked what we saw from Hoosier Philly, but I don't want to get too carried away. She had everything her way on this day, all the fractions coded in blue. I mean, you don't need pace figures to know a 25-23 opening quarter is going to favor Hoosier Philly over Wet Pain, who was toiling back in last. And it's just kind of her downside. She just doesn't have any early speed, and it's going to get her in some trouble. We talked about her a lot throughout the spring as we were moving up to the Oaks, and we were both a little concerned that it would eventually get to her, and it has now 2 races in a row where that off the pace style, it's tough to overcome over and over again. And she ran fine, but she just had no chance given the setup.
And this is one of those rare situations where a closer who lost a race actually gets a higher speed figure than the winner on Timeform US, because Wet Paint really did do a lot of work to close for second in here, just given how slow the pace was. I mean, she had a right to get nothing in this race, and she was able to run up into a clear second, actually making up some ground on Hoosier Philly through the stretch. So she gets a 109 Timeform US speed figure. The winner, Hoosier Philly, gets a 107, and I think that just speaks to the fact that one was really against it, and one was very with the pace of this race. But as for Hoosier Philly, Craig, I mean, she was never asked for anything. I mean, she looked like the Hoosier Philly that was winning races last year as a 2-year-old. Edgar Morales was just basically a statue through the stretch, never asking her for even a lick of run. And that's when she's at her best. She's a really strong galloper who, when she can run those even fractions, she's very effective. We'll see if she can step it up against some tougher competition later in the season, because I would imagine Tom Amoss is going to have some of the major 3-year-old filly races on her calendar now that it seems like she's back doing well again.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I don't know if I would get too carried away. I mean, this was just a listed stakes. I don't know if you mentioned she only got a 107 that was upgraded a little bit for pace. Wet Pink got a much bigger pace upgrade. I'd need to see more before I thought she was ready for top class fillies.
The other race we'll mention from Ellis Park this past week was a Thursday maiden special weight event for the 2-year-olds, won by second-time starter Rhyme Schemes, going out for the Norm Cassie barn. And Craig, interesting that this horse is coming out of the exact same maiden race at Churchill Downs as Gold Sweep, that very impressive Tremont winner from last week at Belmont Park, who took such a huge step forward to, I think, get a 109 Timeform US speed figure in that Tremont. And here's Rhyme Schemes, who finished, I think, 6th in that Churchill maiden race, coming back for his second start and getting a 103, just running away from this field. That feels like a very live race at Churchill, and we got two really talented 2-year-olds that came out of it.
Yeah, we're pretty early in the season to be getting these triple digit 2-year-old speed figures, but visually watching the race you mentioned and watching Rhyme Schemes, there's certainly nothing to argue with. He ran a great race here, a 103. I do see in Timeform US we have it coded as a day that was heavily speed favoring. I admittedly haven't gone back and watched the races. It's something I'll do later today, but this horse didn't show a whole lot for Norm Cass in his debut, but he certainly took a step forward second time out. And that's kind of a thing if you look at the trainer stats for Norm Cass, that he does this, where first time out they don't really show that much, but second time they take a step forward. But this was a huge step forward.
Yeah, I haven't watched the other races at Ellis either, but just glancing through the charts, it does feel like there are at least a couple of prices, rhyme schemes included, that did wire fields on the dirt. So, maybe that factored into the victory. Also, the fact that this horse got to set a slow pace. But, I mean, a big part of those blue color coded fractions are just how fast this horse finished relative to the rest of the field. Because if this horse was taken out of the race, we wouldn't be seeing, such a strong blue color coding, because nobody else was finishing with the speed of this horse. I mean, it's like he was shot out of a cannon as soon as they got into the stretch. The way he was running through the wire, really impressive run from this guy. I believe he is a son of Ghost Sapper out of a distorted humor mare. It's, not a huge damn side pedigree, but clearly there's some precocity and speed here. So we'll be interested to see where he lands for his next start, likely in a stakes.
Yeah, it's not easy to go from a 84 opening quarter mile in a 5 furlong race all the way up to that fast 103 final time figure. What I'm paraphrasing, I forget the exact numbers, but yeah, it was just a very impressive finish at 5 furlongs.
Let's move on to Santa Anita, where we'll wrap up the show. Their stakes there this past weekend on Sunday was the Grade 3 San Juan Capistrano, that mile and three-quarter test of stamina on the turf course that begins on the downhill turf. This one was won in dominant fashion, Craig, by Planetario, Richard Mandela trainee, who originally was from Brazil, actually a Group 1 winner in Brazil, took a few starts in the U.S. to sort of get acclimated, really get into top four, but really seems like he's done so now, because he was just in another league than the competition he was facing on Sunday.
Yeah, it seems like some people might say it was the distance. I don't have an official speed figure for this one yet. I'm guessing it's going to be about a 119. And for races of this distance, it's almost more like a class rating. But he earned it. He won so easily in here. I think it was as much that just third time in the country, just getting better as a 5-year-old as it was the distance. That certainly didn't help, as he is kind of a marathon specialist, but he's going to have a good time in Southern California running in these longer races. Now, they don't have many quite this long, but he's had success at a mile and a half in the past, and there will be plenty of spots for him there.
Yeah, it did feel like some of those in behind him just were not suited to this longer, demanding trip. But, I mean, the way that this horse finished off the race was really impressive. And, I mean, this Southern California turf division tends to be open to a runner with some real talent. So if he can produce this same form over a mile and a half, or perhaps even a little shorter, he's going to be a tough one to reckon with through the rest of the year in California. Another turf race from this past week at Santa Anita was a Friday allowance race, just going the 5.5 furlong distance on the grass, won by Noble Reflection. And this was a horse, Craig, that won a couple of turf sprints at Santa Anita earlier this year in very fast time. I think he might have set a track record down the 6.5 furlong downhill course at Santa Anita a little bit earlier this year. Tried a stakes race. Churchill just was outfooted every step of the way, but getting back to the 5.5 against a smaller field at Santa Anita seemed to suit him.
Yeah, that's a horse I like. I'm glad to see they've kind of found his niche and what he's good at. I remember when he had that big breakout maiden win as a 3-year-old, and they kind of ran him into Lexington, and I actually thought he was going to run well, and kind of derailed him. Maybe he got rushed a little bit, but since he's moved to turf, he's become really good. He's won 3 out of his last 4, as you mentioned. He's done it from 5 furlongs all the way up to 6.5 down the hill. So he's a horse that has some talent, and he ran a 119 speed figure on Friday. So a horse who I would imagine will be right back in stakes and given another chance. He certainly run figures that would make him competitive there.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see this horse actually try a mile at some point on the turf. I know that he was not successful routing on the dirt, but he seems to sort of lack the speed to compete in those 5 furlong turf sprints, and the Breeders' Cup will be at 5 furlongs on the turf this year in the Breeders' Cup turf sprint. So just not sure that's the right situation for him, even though he does have gate speed to win these 5.5, 6.5 furlong races. I wonder if he might be able to relax on the lead and stretch to the mile. He just seems like a horse that might have that kind of versatility and speed can sometimes be a little more dangerous when you go those longer trips. So I'll be interested to see what they do with him, because like you said, this horse has real talent, and just needs to find the right kind of situation that he can really show it. One more race to discuss on the podcast this week. It was a Sunday maiden special weight event for the 2-year-olds, won by the Bob Baffert trained Monmouth. And, the horse that had garnered so much of the oxygen for the Bob Baffert stable among his juveniles this week was Miramati, who debuted in a stakes race on Saturday. Disappointingly, he lost that race, was never really in contention to win it, but Muth was the one that really stole the show on Sunday, just opening up on the field early, never letting anybody else get into the race. This is a horse that was purchased at OBS March for $2 million on the heels of a 9 3/5 1 furlong workout, so certainly was able to translate that speed to the racetrack in the afternoon a few months later.
He wound up, I'm going to guess he's going to get about a 104 TimeformUS speed figure. Obviously, this race was one just full of first-time starters, but there were plenty of dirt races, plenty of sprints on the card that I'm pretty confident that this figure will come back fast. And yeah, I don't know not a whole lot to say when they just run 5 furlongs. That's kind of not a move Bob Baffert usually makes. He usually waits till they go a little bit longer. We see more of his horses showing up at Del Mar. But this one obviously has some real talent and will be in a stakes race, I would imagine, next time, and be heavily bet. And it looks like he'd be one that'd be pretty hard to oppose based on this effort.
Yeah, like you, I don't want to get too caught up in these early season June 2-year-old figures, but this one obviously has a lot of speed. We'll see if he can carry it a little bit farther when the Del Mar meet comes, but I imagine we'll see him in one of the stakes races there pretty early in the meet. Well, Craig, that's all the stakes racing to recap from this past week. I'll have one podcast left coming up with you this Friday, then I'll be taking a vacation next week, so I'm going to leave it up to Craig whether he's going to do any podcasts without me, but I know he'll have a little bit of extra work on his hands, so maybe we'll take a little bit of a hiatus from the podcast, but I'll kind of leave that in your hands, Craig. But we will be back for a forecast together later this week. I think maybe we'll lean towards doing Belmont. I'll see how that all works out. I know they have a stake schedule there, but we'll check out some of those cards, and we'll connect on that a little later in the week, Craig.
Yeah, I'll keep people posted on what I'm going to do for Pacecast forecast. I may take the week off. I don't mind telling people I'm filling in for you doing the morning line at Belmont, and I'm sure it takes me a bit longer to do it than you, as I don't have near the experience. So we'll see. It's probably one where I'll just post the speed figures from this weekend on Twitter and let people see how the others performed.
Yeah, I'd be happy for you to take that week off, given the extra work that you're taking on in my absence. And unfortunately, you're saddled with a 5-day racing week, as Belmont will be running on Friday through Tuesday on that 4th of July week. But yeah, very, very grateful that you're stepping in to do that for me, Craig. Well, we will be back for the forecast, like I said, later this week. So make sure to catch that. Everybody, always thanks for listening to these podcasts. You can catch them on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back later in the week for that TimeformUS forecast.